So anyway, it's a pleasure to introduce Courtney Stewart. Courtney is a research scientist at the VA, actually. Um, she did her PhD at the University of Mississippi on vestibular function, and subsequently was a postdoc here with Mike King, and has worked on vestibular function and also the effects of noise, and has recently been funded with an R01 to study that topic, and is interested in motor function and balance, which is certainly a topic of interest to us. So please, Courtney, go ahead.
Thank you. Screen really quick. Okay, can everyone see the main slide? Okay. I'm just going to move this out of the way. The title of my talk is Vestibular Hypofunction and Impaired Motor Performance in Noise-Exposed Rats. These are my views and don't reflect the opinions of the US government. Just need to have the disclaimer. So I'll start here. Noise exists where we live, where we work, where we travel, in our recreational activities, and is something that all people can expect to encounter in some area of life. It is unavoidable. It's the second most common cause of acquired hearing loss after aging, and 1 in 4 adults between 20 and 69 years of age have audiometric notches that indicate noise-induced hearing loss. In addition to hearing loss, perceptual deficits and tinnitus are also strongly linked to noise overexposure. And although noise exposure is commonly implicated as a cause of acquired hearing loss, the possibility of concomitant vestibular damage is less understood. Because the sacculus is located behind the oval window, it is exposed to considerable force from the footplate of the stapes. I hope to convince you today that vestibular problems may indeed be linked to noise-induced vestibular injury, and more importantly, may be linked to motor impairment, which may contribute to increased fall risk. The inner ear is located within the petrous portion of the temporal bone here, and the labyrinth is a continuous fluid pathway shared between the cochlea and vestibular structures. Externally, we see the bony labyrinth, which encases the membranous labyrinth, and the membranous labyrinth contains auditory and vestibular structures, the 3 semicircular canal cristae, which detect angular velocity, and the 2 otolith organs, the saccule and the utricle, which detect linear acceleration and gravity. Although there are 5 vestibular sensory structures within the inner ear, the focus of today's talk will be on the otolith organs in this red circle. The saccule rests directly behind the footplate of the stapes and senses vertical linear accelerations. The utricle is positioned at a 90-degree angle to the saccule and senses horizontal linear accelerations. The vestibular apparatus is closely positioned to the cochlea, as you can see here. So it's possible that sound waves which activate the cochlea also reach the vestibular structures, particularly the otolith organs. There are many causes of vestibular dysfunction, including illness like diabetes or events like a stroke. There are drugs that cause vestibular dysfunction, including aminoglycosides and platins. Some chemical exposures, including nitriles, toluenes, xylenes, JP8, and other compounds can damage the vestibular periphery and the cochlea, but intense noise exposure has the ability to cause damage to the vestibular periphery as well. It's well known that noise exposure can cause hearing loss, and it has also been established that noise exposure causes reduced vestibular function in human and animal studies. Some evidence suggests that noise exposure is a factor that leads to increased fall risk, especially in older adults. And vestibular dysfunction increases fall risk more than 2-fold. So people with hearing loss are more likely to experience an injury due to a fall, but this risk has been traditionally linked to auditory and not vestibular dysfunction, which is surprising to me, but maybe not to some. Here you see a diagram created by Anka Belazar, the engineer in my collaborator Natella Shinitzi's lab at the Smith-Kittlewell Eye Research Institute, based on just a lot of the literature that we've reviewed over time to show things that may contribute commonly to both hearing loss and reduced vestibular dysfunction. And the ones that do most here that we have, noise exposure and aging. The evidence is piling up, but some of it is still, we still need to learn more. There's epidemiological evidence that suggests noise exposure is a factor that increased fall risk in older adults, but making a tighter link between imbalance, impaired mobility, and noise-induced vestibular loss or central effects of noise exposure, I think is a very important next step. So a rat model was used to explore the effects of noise on the vestibular periphery. We evaluated 3 aspects of noise-induced vestibular injury. First, we looked at morphology and asked, are there changes in the vestibular periphery after noise exposure? Next, we looked at physiology and asked, are there changes in vestibular evoked potentials following noise exposure? Last, we looked at behavior and asked, are there changes in motor performance related to noise-induced vestibular impairment? I'm going to start with a pretty well-established noise exposure method in my lab. Each rat in the noise exposure group received a 6-hour exposure to 120 decibel sound pressure level noise. You can see peaks in the 120 dB range, but much of it is just above 110. The frequency range of the noise exposure ranged from approximately 500 hertz to 4 kilohertz, as you can see here. While this encompasses a large portion of the human hearing range, we see that this is fairly low frequency for a rat, based on the region of the cochlea that this noise exposure has been determined to activate, which is about the uppermost 20%, including the apex and just a little bit of the middle turn. It should be noted that this noise exposure was chosen for the rat model, but these results may not translate well to human studies just because maybe a different frequency range is more damaging. So the first question, how does noise damage the vestibular periphery? First, let's talk about the vestibular periphery. Vestibular hair cells have cell bodies with 2 different morphologies. There's a flask-shaped type 1 hair cell and a more cylindrical type 2 hair cell. Both have a hair bundle with a single kinocilium and numerous stereocilia connected by tip links. The hair bundle is displaced by motion of fluid through the labyrinth to stretch the tip links and activate hair cells. There are 2 types of terminals that innervate hair cells, calyx and bouton, that arise from 3 populations of afferents. The calyx-only afferent population is specific to the streolar region of the saccule, and these all tend to be very irregularly firing. There's also a bouton-only population, which tends to exist more peripherally and fires very regularly. And in between, throughout the sensory epithelia, are dimorphic afferent terminations that can produce both a calyx and a bouton ending. This is by far the largest population of afferents and has the widest range of physiological properties depending on their location, where central is very irregular like a calyx only, and if you get very peripheral with dimorphic terminals, they become more bouton-like. Vestibular evoked potentials are thought to be produced by afferents ending in calyces. They can be divided into 2 classes, again, the calyx only, and then the dimorphic calyces, which function in a more irregular fashion because they're located in the streolar or juxtastriolar region. And we'll get more into that in just a moment. So first, we'll also talk about the sensory hair cells a little bit more. Sensory hair cells obviously exist throughout the sensory epithelium and can be labeled with myosin 7A. They're a common target of auditory and vestibular studies. Prior animal studies have attempted to correlate noise-induced vestibular dysfunction with missing or damaged hair cells, but these studies haven't presented consistent structural evidence for noise-induced vestibular loss. And these inconsistencies in the literature may be due in part to the focus of the previous studies on sensory hair cells rather than the afferents that innervate them. So the next step will be afferents. We like to label structurally all afferents with neurofilament, and this helps us to morphologically define calyces. I've already talked a little bit about dimorphic calyx properties, but when we immunostain them, we use an antibody against neurofilament and then use confocal microscopy to image them from top to bottom. We primarily focus just on the calyceal terminations labeled with neurofilament at this time and compare overall counts between control and noise-exposed rats. There's also this specialized population that's very important to what I'm doing and how we morphologically identify our region of interest. So this is the streolar region. This is the only place where a calyx-only terminal will exist. We label these calyx-only terminals with calretinin, and then we count them in the region of interest, defined by the striolor region. And we use this defined region for all of our counts. So calretinin is, again, just a very useful antibody for us to have. For this reason. So we use calretinin to define here this region of interest, and it's 100 by 200 microns. The most important part of the work that I'm going to show, again, is the irregular calyx-only afferent. It's partially important because it's sensitive to sound as well as linear acceleration. And we hypothesize that this population is also susceptible to noise exposure. As I stated in the previous slide, calyx-only terminals are only found in the central or striolor zone. And we label this with the calretinin antibody. We find that fewer calyx-only afferent terminals are visible 28 days after exposure to a single 120 decibel sound pressure level noise. There's a decrease in calretinin expression in calyx-only afferents innervating the saccule and utricle. There also appears to be a narrowing of the striolor region in the saccule. In fact, the striolor band outlined in white is both narrower and less densely filled versus the control. We also see less density of calyx-only terminations in the utricle, but the band overall is approximately the same width, even though it's a bit more jagged after noise exposure. So based on this data alone, it's not clear if calyces are lost or if calretinin expression is produced. But we also did counts for total calyces and hair cells and found that intense noise exposure does not alter hair cell or total calyx number. So the lack of difference between the control and noise exposed suggests that while calyx-only afferent endings are more difficult to identify after noise exposure, they're not missing. And an almost exactly the same number of hair cells suggests that noise-induced vestibular loss with this paradigm, although maybe not other paradigms, is not due to hair cell loss, although damage to hair bundles is a possibility. And we hypothesize that reduced vestibular function associated with noise exposure is caused by changes in integrity of sensory cell synaptic connections, rather than direct loss of structures based on this data or loss of hair cells. So the first takeaway is that fewer calretinin positive calyx terminations are identified after noise exposure. The vestibular aspect of the inner ear is not only sensitive to gravity and movement of the head in space, but some afferents are also sound sensitive.
So,
In our analysis,
sorry, can I interrupt and ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So is this a permanent effect or is this reversible?
Depends on what you're doing. This effect is relatively permanent. Okay. We haven't gone out for years, but we've gone out for months and even out to maybe 12 to 14 months of age. And we don't really see a lot of improvement in these rats. And so well beyond a time where you would see stereocilia bundles regenerate, whether functional or non-functional, we don't really see a lot of improvement over time. But I've got some more stuff that you might be interested in coming up. So even the single exposure to loud noise altered the saccule, suggesting that the saccule is most sound sensitive, but the utricle is also susceptible, and was also, we had a significant reduction in the number of calyx-only terminals there too. So exposure to intense noise is associated with the reduced number of calyx-only terminals in the saccule and utricle, despite the presence of hair cells and the structural portion of the calyx existing no problem. But how does this relate to reduced vestibular afferent activity? Will we also see reduced responses to a stimulus that activates these structures? So question 2, does noise-induced damage cause measurable peripheral dysfunction? And we can look at this with a VSEP. So in my graduate studies, I did terminal procedures where I actually had to open the skull, remove a portion of the cerebellum, and drop a quartz electrode down into the vestibular nerve and do single unit recording. And so whatever time point we chose was the time point we got. And we couldn't really look before or after that time point to see how vestibular changes were evolving or if recovery was occurring. there was a benefit to doing single unit recording in that we could characterize a broad range of vestibular afferents. But the VSEP is a wonderful tool for tracking injury and recovery, even though it focuses on irregulars, because the irregulars may indeed be the most sensitive population to acoustic overexposure. And it's possible that there are mechanisms that also damage regular and intermediate afferents that may not be able to produce an evoked potential. But the VSEP overall is a wonderful way to just get a sense of what's going on in the vestibular periphery after noise. The vestibular short latency evoked potential is a far field potential evoked by linear acceleration of the head in the naso-occipital direction, and is thought to be a test of eighth nerve and central activity arising from otolith organ activation. The P1N1 wave shown here is thought to arise from the vestibular nerve, and the P2N2 wave shown here is thought to arise from the vestibular nuclear complex. Previous studies suggest that afferents terminating in calyx endings could be primary sources of the VSEP, again, especially those in and around the striolar region. We hypothesize that noise exposure causes pathological changes in calyceal synapses that disrupt signal transmission. And indeed, that's pretty much what I'm going to show you here. So 120 dB SPL noise exposure does cause VSEP deficits that persist for at least a month after noise. On the left, I show responses to the 5 stimuli presented on the previous slide. The top traces the response to the smallest stimulus, where you can see P1N1 here and P2N2 here. And the bottom trace is the response to the largest stimulus, where P1N1 and P2N2 are very obvious. Responses to all stimuli are clear and well-defined prior to noise exposure. However, after noise exposure, responses to all stimuli are reduced, with the exception of the response to the smallest stimulus, which is completely wiped out. And as expected, response amplitudes to all stimulus levels are significantly reduced, both peripherally, evidenced by the P1N1 amplitude change, and centrally, shown here by the P2N2 amplitude change, a significant reduction across the board. This is also affecting latency of the response, onset latency, which is prolonged both at the central and peripheral waveform. Taken together, this data suggests that responses occur more slowly and possibly less synchronously, and that may be what's causing this reduced amplitude. So question 3, is peripheral vestibular dysfunction associated with impaired motor performance? We can test that. We have a balance beam equipped with 2 sensors to objectively identify start and stop times. S1, so each is fitted with an emitter and sensor. These are placed 30 centimeters apart, so the rat has plenty of room to cross through them. And trials are initiated when the infrared beam sensor connection is broken in the first sensor, S1. And the trial ends when the beam connection is broken here at S2. And then the rat can go into his home cage underneath a nice cover and feel safe. And that has been adequately reinforcing for us to get the rats to cross over and over and over. We've done food rewards. We've tried multiple things. And there's just nothing like giving a natural reward like the safety of home. So that's been a nice and simple way to train these rats. Trials are assigned a score of 1, 2, or 3. They get a 1 if there are no stops or slips and the trial is completed in under 5 seconds. And these are the trials that are used for balance beam crossing time analysis. Trials are assigned a score of 2 if there are 1 to 3 slips or stops, which would interrupt the walking for a moment and no longer really be a good measure of walking speed. And but the rat does cross the beam in under 5 seconds. And then we can use these trials to assess crossing time, but we really don't want to. Instead, we use them, maybe the times, but mostly the notes that we take to provide insight into changes in success rate and issues that arise. So for example, stops versus slips following noise exposure in the context of time it takes for a complete cross. An example of this would be if a rat crosses at the same speed with more slips, they might be having a coordination or walking issue. And on the other hand, if they were walking at the same speed with more stops, they may have elevated anxiety about the task, which would actually be a completely different problem. And then trials assigned a score of 3 are considered failures because the rat has stopped or slipped 4 or more times, fallen, turned around, or refused to cross. This is something that tends to come up more in older age or after a fall. So often after noise exposure, rats will go through periods of time where maybe they fall early on in the testing day and they just don't want to do it after that. We don't see a lot of failures, but we do see a slight increase after noise exposure, with often a greater increase as rats get older, especially if they have a noise exposure history. When we have a failure, we can note the cause of failure and quantify the failure rate, but in most cases, we don't get a complete cross, and so we can't really do anything with crossing time at that point. We ask that the rats do 10 trials per day, 2 days per week. And all of the testing for this initial data was done in a brightly lit room, which will become important later on. And we find that noise exposed rats indeed do walk more slowly after a 120 decibel sound pressure level noise. Mean balance beam crossing times are significantly elevated from baseline, noted by the red asterisk. So this is just noise exposed rats versus their own baseline. Mean control balance beam crossing times are not different from baseline at any time point. But at baseline, noise and control crossing times, well, also at baseline, noise and control crossing times are not significantly different, but during weeks 1 through 4, control and noise crossing times are significantly different, noted here by the black asterisks. And 5 weeks after noise exposure, rats' crossing times remained elevated, but were no longer statistically significant versus baseline or control. So this could be related to a couple of things. We could say that the rats have gotten better, but we know that they haven't, because we know that 28 days after noise exposure and even 2 months after noise exposure, VSEPs look about the same. So we wonder, maybe this is compensation. Maybe the rats are becoming more dependent on another sensory system in order to cross and improve enough to be similar to their own baseline at 1 month. More on that in a little while. So this work explored 120 dB SPL noise-induced otolith organ damage in rats at the cellular, physiological, and behavioral levels. Taken together, these data suggest that 120 dB SPL noise causes fewer calyx-only afferent terminals labeled with calretinin in the saccule and utricle, reduced VSEP amplitude and prolonged latency, suggesting otolith organ dysfunction, and increased balance beam crossing time for 4 weeks after noise exposure, followed by an improvement. And we aren't really sure why such a thing would happen at this stage. But the 120 dB SPL model has served as a great proof of concept to demonstrate that noise can lesion the vestibular periphery in a relatively short period of time. But this is not designed to replicate a real-world situation and is likely not something that any person would ever willingly or unwillingly be subjected to. Thus, our transition to new work in noise exposure paradigms that mimic real-world conditions. And so one might think, oh, I would never be in any environment over 100 decibels, much less 110. But our military are, and we are too. Sound levels on flight decks are approximately 126 decibels, but reach 148 decibels when tactical aircrafts reach full power for aircraft checks. The PPE and engineering controls that are available cannot mitigate these sound levels. To mitigate these sound levels or reduce them to a safe level, nothing exists. Tracked vehicle cabins reach sound levels in excess of 110 dB. And sounds at concerts and sporting events can exceed 110 dB as well. And even motorcycles exceed this sound level. Despite the availability of hearing protection, it's often underutilized. And it's been demonstrated that while hearing protection is effective to prevent noise-induced hearing loss, it is less protective against vestibular dysfunction. And I also just want to add here, because it's been relevant in a recently funded grant, that there's actually a lawsuit against 3M for combat hearing protection devices used between, I believe, the early aughts and like 20 teens. These devices failed to protect people's hearing, I believe, because they were faulty and kept falling out of the ears. And so there was a significant amount of noise exposure in this population of service members that is now causing severe hearing loss and tinnitus. And it's likely also causing vestibular dysfunction. But can the same frequency spectrum at a reduced sound level produce temporary hearing and vestibular loss? Each rat in the noise exposure group received a 6-hour 110 dB SPL noise exposure while awake, 110 dB SPL peak, and was free to move around in a small enclosure. The frequency range is the same as before, activating about the uppermost 20% of the rat cochlea. Oops, excuse me. And a single 6-hour, 1.5 kilohertz centered 3-octave band, 110 dB SPL noise does cause a temporary vestibular threshold shift that recovers over about a week. And you can see that here. These arrows are showing 2 distinct peaks. Those are no longer present 1 day after noise exposure, but do come back by 1 week after noise exposure. And you can see here that the threshold elevation was significant. This is in Gs per millisecond. So it doesn't look very impressive, but it is a bit of a jump. There were multiple stems that did not activate a VSEP in our rats, in some of our rats. And although it wasn't fully recovered by 3 days, and was a bit elevated from baseline for the duration of the study, all of these values were statistically similar to baseline. In the same traces, reduced amplitude and prolonged latency of responses are also observed and also recover. So at baseline, small yet distinct responses are visible in response to the smallest head jerk stimulus. 1 day after noise exposure, no discernible response could be elicited in response to the smallest stimulus, suggesting a threshold shift. But if you look up here, these boxes are the same size in just different colors. We also have much smaller amplitudes at 1 day after noise exposure. However, by 3 days after noise exposure, the second largest amplitude or second smallest amplitude is pretty much back to 100%. And these two are probably 75 to 80%, if not better, by 1 week after noise exposure. And when we plot out these data, we see the same thing. So we see a significant reduction 1 day after noise exposure, but most of these values are very similar to baseline. 7 and 28 days after. Latency is also initially prolonged, but recovers for the most part with the exception of the smallest stimulus. And then more recently, after we published that study, we identified this transient decrease in calretinin expression as well, which was, I thought, really interesting. In control tissue, we see, so some of these are actually hair cells. Calretinin labels a couple of things, but here we have these striatal bands. They're pretty nice, thick and densely labeled, relatively high counts in the control tissue. 1 day after noise, we collected tissue from some of the rats, and they had many fewer calluses than control, significantly fewer. But we waited for 6 more days and collected the rest of the tissue 1 week after noise. And at that time, there was a pretty nice recovery of calretinin expression. I guess maybe it's hard to call it a recovery, but rats that were terminated 7 days after noise exposure had more calretinin positive calyces than rats terminated 1 day after noise exposure. And that's kind of interesting. It shows a functional role for calretinin. So this work explored the transient effects of 110 dB SPL noise-induced otolith organ damage in rats at the cellular and physiological levels. Taken together, these data suggest that 110 dB SPL noise exposure causes elevated VSEP thresholds 1 day and 3 days after noise exposure that recover in most rats 1 week after noise exposure, reduced VSEP amplitude and prolonged latency suggesting otolith organ dysfunction, a transient reduction in calyx-only afferent terminals labeled with calretinin in the saccule and utricle, And this work suggests that noise is capable of causing temporary or persistent vestibular dysfunction, depending on the characteristics of the noise exposure model. So our next question is whether it's possible, to produce persistent vestibular damage and dysfunction by repeating noise exposures that produce lesser deficits. So the next phase of this work used a 110 dB SPL 3-hour broadband noise exposure that was repeated every 2 weeks. So this started with about 6 weeks of balance beam training, and then baselines were established here. A small group of rats was used for VSEP only, just to get longitudinal data. I'll go ahead and say that this data is pretty badly underpowered, but did show a cumulative change. And so I wanted to go ahead and throw it in, but it's not quite where it needs to be. And then we have a nice little group of balance beam rats that were tested twice weekly in the light condition during noise exposures. That will become relevant in a minute. They were noise exposed 4 times, 2 weeks apart. And for the VSEP rats, we tested them 1 and 7 days after each exposure until the last exposure, when we were also able to get the 28-day measurement to get kind of a final picture of the persistence of a repeated noise exposure. So repeated 3-hour 110 dB SPL broadband noise exposure causes cumulative and persistent VSEP changes. So if we just start over here, this is the 28-day measurement. I thought that I animated this slide. So the data aren't quite significant for some of these, but you can tell that they're well on their way. But the 3.8 G per millisecond, which is a great go-to for a VSEP because it's kind of a nice moderate jerk, that is significantly reduced after 4 exposures. And when we take the 3.2 G per millisecond data and break it out by every measurement, we see that it's basically a slow reduction. Although here we don't see a lot of recovery from 1 to 7 days. And I'm not really sure why, but I could argue we were not using masking when we were doing the initial 110 dB SPL paper, and now we are. And it's possible that these rats are getting more noise exposure than and more regular noise exposures than every other week. So that is something that we need to sort out. But we do see this cumulative reduction over time that that leads to this significant reduction over here. I should also note that by the 4th exposure, this is a pretty moderate stimulus. It's pretty strong, and these responses were below threshold. So that was surprising to me. This is actually a little bit worse than 120 decibel sound pressure level in that way. But more interestingly, repeated 3-hour exposures to 110 dB SPL broadband noise cause cumulative increases in walking speed versus non-noise exposed controls, with one exception. So overall, noise exposures cumulatively did increase walking speed. These noise exposures started when the rats were 7 months of age and were repeated every other week for a total of 4 by the time rats were about 8.5 months old. The rats were tested twice weekly, just to recap, in a brightly lit room, 10 trials per day, and 4 trials per treatment were averaged for each data point. After 1 noise exposure, crossing times are slower than baseline and control crossing times. So the blue asterisks are versus control, the red asterisks are versus baseline. After 2 and 3 exposures, crossing times improve slightly and are different than noise baselines 3 weeks after noise exposure, shown here. And after the 4th exposure, rats are significantly different from baseline in control and noise exposed groups, unfortunately. And we're not really sure what happened there, but I think we just need more data. And although not shown here, the month after the final noise or control treatment, crossing times were basically the same as baseline. And so because these rats were assessed in a brightly lit room and looked very, very bad in their VSEP measurements, we can't really say that their vestibular system's improved, causing them to be back on track. We're suggesting that perhaps they're relying more heavily on vision when their balance system is compromised. And to test that, we added a dark condition in which the experimenter observed crossings in a room with no sources of light other than a single infrared lamp, which allows us to see, but is a bit below the visible spectrum of light for a rat. And is something that I've used in the past in other studies. And noise-exposed rats are more visually dependent, which is quite interesting. These crossings were tested twice per week. The light and dark conditions were assessed on alternating counterbalance days. So week 1, we might do light on Monday, dark on Wednesday. And then the following week, we would do another dark day on Monday and a light day on Wednesday, just to remove any effect of testing day. At the time of these studies, noise-exposed and control rats were crossing the beam faster than they did at their respective baselines. So this is the pre-noise baseline, and this is the control baseline, and both of them are performing better in the light than they did at baseline. But in the dark condition, while both groups slowed down, the noise-exposed rats slowed down significantly versus their own light crossing time and the control dark crossing time. And so this is something that we're exploring further right now. And it's kind of, I think, an exciting result. And so to summarize, the results of this work indicate that lesser noise exposures produce cumulative changes in balance beam crossing speed in the lights on condition. After recovering for 1 month from a series of 4 110 dB SPL noise exposures, rats appear to compensate under light conditions. And this is consistent with the previously published 120 dB SPL data. When rats are challenged in a dark testing condition, which was expected to reduce compensation, indeed, slower crossing times were observed in noise-exposed, but not age-matched control rats. And this increased in balance beam crossing time under dark conditions suggests that an underlying deficit is still present. In addition to the changes observed in balance beam crossing, VSEP responses also worsen with repeated noise exposures. So results of this work build on prior studies to demonstrate that moderate intensity noise is capable of producing cumulative damage, resulting in impaired vestibular function and slower walking speed in rats. And so in the future, we hope to develop pharmacologic approaches to prevent or treat noise-induced vestibular dysfunction, examine the interaction between noise exposure history and aging, examine brain structures that may be affected by peripheral vestibular dysfunction and or noise exposure, and measure changes in spatial memory associated with noise exposure history, age, and or peripheral vestibular dysfunction. And my next slide is an acknowledgement slide, but I do have some rapamycin and 7,8-dihydroxyflavone data that I could present just depending on how many questions there are. Do we want to break for a moment and have questions and then jump over to rapamycin, or go ahead and jump right in?
Why don't you just go ahead? I mean, if you have just a few slides, go ahead, because we've got plenty of time, I think.
I think so too, yeah. I wasn't sure if I wanted to include it, but a lot of us are familiar with rapamycin. It's a macrolide antibiotic with immunosuppressive and anti-proliferative properties, and it inhibits mTOR, the mammalian target of rapamycin. This compound is most commonly used to prevent transplant rejection, but is being explored in a variety of studies. Interesting to us are aging and longevity and neurodegenerative disease. The benefits of rapamycin treatment and prevention of age-related hearing loss have been observed. Unpublished work has demonstrated delayed age-related hearing loss in noise-exposed mice as well, but it's unclear if rapamycin may exert a similar effect on the vestibular periphery. And so we just wanted to find out, does rapamycin first have a protective effect on vestibular and motor function? So we had 3 groups, a control group, a noise-exposed group that received the vehicle treatment, and a noise-exposed group that received the rapamycin diet. The vehicle and the rapamycin were encapsulated in Udall and just put into their chow. So there wasn't any dosing or thought involved. It was a really nice, straightforward way to get this drug into the rats in a very consistent way. And I thought that was really great. And I should also note here that the noise for this was 120 dB SPL noise, which we've shown has a persistent effect. Although not on balance beam, we weren't able to test that in a dark condition. And we found that rats fed a rapamycin diet have less noise-induced vestibular loss, especially at this 3.2 G per millisecond stimulus, which is, again, just a nice moderate stimulus. So on the left, you see VSEP response characteristics from 12-month-old, control in black, rapamycin in blue, and vehicle in red rats immediately prior to euthanasia after VSEPs were recorded. Noise-exposed rats that received the vehicle diet were qualitatively different from controls in response to the moderate head jerk stimulus. And noise-exposed rats that were fed the rapamycin diet are similar to controls. Noise exposure caused significant differences from control in rapamycin. That's the blue asterisk, and vehicle-treated rats, and it's just much more significant. So, but rapamycin treatment also led to significantly larger P1 amplitude than vehicle-treated rats. So that's just, again, not super significant. Definitely the rapamycin diet did benefit the rats versus a vehicle diet. And then on the right here, we see calyx-only afferent terminals in the striolar region of the otolith organs. This is the same region of interest that I showed before. In this leftmost panel, we see controlled tissue for utricle and saccule. The middle panel is noise-exposed rats fed the vehicle diet. And on the right, we see rapamycin diet rats that were exposed to the 120 dB SPL noise. So here we see that non-noise exposed rats had significantly more calyces than vehicle-treated noise-exposed rats. There was not a significant difference between non-noise exposed and rapamycin-treated rats, although there was a small significant difference between the vehicle and rapamycin-treated rats. So the vehicle guys, they're pretty bad off. In the saccule, it's a bit more subjected to this damaging noise. And so unfortunately, we're pretty much just happy with this result and a little bit surprised by it, that we saw a slightly significant reduction versus control here, but not a significant difference between the rapamycin treated and the non-noise exposed. So there is still a slight reduction in rats that are fed vehicle diet. And that suggests that even with a lot of damage, the rapamycin can help to overcome some of it. Next, we see rats fed the rapamycin diet also have smaller short-term and long-term effects of noise and exposure on motor function. And so on the left here, I have this broken down by week. 1 week after noise exposure, balance beam crossing time is elevated in rapamycin and vehicle-treated rats that were noise exposed. Rats that receive vehicle diet recover minimally following the noise exposure. So you can see that they just still kind of hang up here. However, rats that receive rapamycin recover from noise exposure more rapidly and are not significantly different from controls or their own baselines at any time point, which is really encouraging. Additionally, control rats that were not noise exposed showed continued improvement over the 6-week period assessed, resulting in a significant difference between the first and last time point. And that's kind of what we want to see, to show just a learning effect. Benefits of protective rapamycin treatment are observed for at least 7 months after the noise exposure as well. So although differences are not observed for 2 months after noise exposure when all data for each month is averaged, noise-exposed rats fed vehicle diet are significantly different from controls at 8 and 12 months of age. And I mean, they're just getting worse and worse. They're really a mess compared to the rapamycin diet rats. Although it would be interesting to track these guys out further. One of the things that was observed with rapamycin in the hearing work was that it delayed age-related hearing loss in non-noise exposed or noise exposed mice, but that it didn't overall prevent it. And so even if we're seeing a delay here, I think that that's a really good start. But it would be interesting to see if there was anything that we could do at later time points to continue to benefit these rats that were noise exposed. And there are no significant differences in rapamycin treated rats, indicating that this protective treatment prevented noise-induced changes in mobility, which is very satisfying. So rapamycin shows benefits in this model at the cellular, physiological, and behavioral level, and it appears to work well to prevent peripheral vestibular dysfunction and motor impairment associated with noise. The otolith organs of noise-exposed rats are less impacted by noise exposure when rapamycin is added to diet. It is not clear if rapamycin would provide similar benefits if started shortly after noise exposure or in rats with established vestibular impairment. But rapamycin in this context appears to have a protective effect rather than a restorative effect on the vestibular periphery. So you want to have some time for questions
Yeah,
or?
sure. So I think, are you all done with their talk? That was quite
Well, I have
interesting.
some more slides. We could do DHF slides as well. I would like to thank my lab, Mary Anderson,
Mhm.
Shelby Powers, and David Bauer, and then the Shinitzi lab. She's the MPI on my RO1. My mentor, Mike King, and Rick Altschuler, and Rick's lab, including Ariane Kanicki, and then my funding. And then the departments that have trained me and then continue to support me now.
Okay, super.
Otolaryngology as a postdoc, and now I've joined internal medicine.
Okay, super. Thank you. So just a question and a comment. So how much rapamycin is this? I mean, as a physician, rapamycin makes me a little anxious because it's not without side effects.
It's got a lot of side effects. It's not a low dose. I
Hmm.
want to say 5 milligrams per kilogram.
Okay. So, but that's in a rat. So,
Mm-hmm.
right. So that would be a lot. Relative to humans,
Big
but
deal.
if you have to adjust, there are formulas for doing that to see what the
Sure.
human equivalent would be. So, yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
And then,
I-
yes.
Yeah, go
And then
ahead.
in terms of side effects, the results that I showed kind of suggest that you don't need to take it long term.
Hmm.
So, it sounds kind of, I
Hmm.
don't know the word, but if I was going to a concert, I might call my doctor and get a prescription for rapamycin,
Rapamycin. Oh,
and I might
jeez.
take it for 2 months and then just call it quits. Because
Oh,
one thing that I actually didn't discuss in a lot of detail
right.
that's worth discussing um,
Mhm.
is that the rats discontinued rapamycin after 8 weeks.
Hmm.
And so by 6 months of age, they are not on rapamycin.
Right.
And then at
Right.
8 and 12 months, we continue to see benefits of the rapamycin, where the noise exposure is causing an increasing amount of difficulty crossing the balance beam in the noise exposed rats. And
Right.
so, if you can just take it as a protective measure, you might not need it long term.
Right.
And I know
So,
that those 2 months might get a little hairy, but um, it it
so
has the
this is the
potential to work on a short term basis.
right. So this is the treatment for people like heavy metal rock music, right? So
Yeah,
yeah, anyway.
yeah. If you're going on tour, you might just be on rapamycin for a while.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my God. Um, yeah, so I guess the other question though, so one of the questions, do you think I mean, what do you think is going on with the calyces? I mean, there there's clearly some kind of effect at the terminals, but I
Yeah,
mean, it's some kind of looks like some kind of synapse, more specific synaptic dysfunction, but
yeah.
so what do you think is going on there?
We're looking at a calcium binding protein. It's possible that it's activity dependent.
Hmm.
So even though we're not seeing a loss of hair cells, we could be seeing hair
Right.
cell dysfunction, downregulating
Hmm.
activity. And that's
Hmm.
something that we haven't been able to assess up
Yeah.
until now. It's also possible that it's a protective measure to reduce maybe further damage to that afferent.
Mhm.
We also have a little bit of data, and I didn't bring it up here, that suggests that there could be some retraction,
Mhm.
but it's such a small N, it's really, really hard
Yeah.
to sell it right now. But what we're seeing is a reduction in the number of single terminals and an increase in the number of very complex calyx terminals. And it's making us kind of question if maybe we're losing some of the calyces, but other
And
calyces are spreading to pick up those hair cells just to keep them. Um, and then that might lead to a lower resolution signal
I
because
see.
we might be
Interesting. Yeah.
getting to a single afferent a lot more information.
Yeah. Okay. So just before I stop the monopolizing this, but just one comment. So, crossing the balance beam task it's obviously been useful for you, but it's a pretty crude measure. Um,
Yeah.
so, Martin Sarter, who used to be one of our Udall investigators, has a much more sophisticated balance task that he
Yes, he
developed.
does.
Yeah.
Yes, he does.
Yeah. So anyway, other questions for Courtney?